The ceremonial hall of Silvercrest Palace stretched before Lena Ashford like a cathedral of judgment, its vaulted ceilings adorned with murals depicting legendary alpha warriors conquering their enemies. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across marble floors where hundreds of pack members stood in rigid formation, their eyes forward, their postures perfect. Lena stood apart from them all, positioned at the very edge of the gathering where the Omegas were always placed, close enough to witness the grandeur but far enough to remember their place in the hierarchy. Her plain gray dress marked her status as clearly as a brand, the rough fabric a stark contrast to the silk and velvet worn by those of higher rank. She kept her gaze lowered, her shoulders hunched inward, trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. It had become her survival strategy over the years. This careful erasure of self, this constant minimizing of her existence in hopes that being overlooked might spare her the casual cruelty that seemed to follow Omegas like a shadow. King Matthias Blackthorn stood at the elevated platform before his throne, his presence dominating the space with an almost physical force. He was everything the old stories promised an alpha king should be, tall and powerfully built with sharp features that seemed carved from granite, dark hair that fell just past his collar, and eyes the color of winter steel that missed nothing. When he spoke, his voice carried through the hall without effort, each word precisely chosen and delivered, with the absolute certainty of someone who had never been contradicted. He was addressing the assembly about territorial disputes with neighboring packs, his tone making it clear that his decisions were not suggestions, but immutable laws. Lena had learned long ago not to look directly at him, not to draw his attention in any way, but she could feel the weight of his authority pressing down on everyone in the room like atmospheric pressure before a storm. The ceremony was meant to honor pack members who had distinguished themselves in service to Silvercrest, and Lena watched as wolves were called forward one by one to receive commendations and gifts from the king's own hand. Betas who had improved trade routes, warriors who had defended borders, even a young alpha who had negotiated a beneficial alliance with a distant pack. Each recipient approached the throne with pride, kneeling before Matthias to accept their recognition while the assembly applauded. It should have been inspiring, this public celebration of merit and contribution, but Lena felt only the familiar ache of exclusion. No Omega had ever been called forward in these ceremonies. Their contributions, such as they were allowed to make, went unacknowledged because the hierarchy demanded their invisibility. Then Matthias did something unexpected. He paused in the middle of calling forward the next honoree and let his gaze sweep across the assembled crowd, moving slowly from the front rows of high-ranking alphas all the way back to where the Omegas clustered. His eyes found Lena with predatory precision, and she felt her breath catch in her throat. For a terrible moment, she wondered if she had violated some protocol she didn't know existed, if her very presence was somehow offensive. The king's expression was unreadable as he gestured toward her with one hand, his voice cutting through the sudden silence that had fallen over the hall. He asked her name, and when she stammered it out, barely audible, he repeated it louder so everyone could hear. "Lena Ashford," he said, as if testing how the syllables felt in his mouth. He asked how long she had been part of Silvercrest, what work she did for the pack, whether she had any particular skills worth mentioning. Each question felt like a trap, and Lena answered in fragments, her voice shaking. She had been born in Silvercrest 23 years ago. She worked in the kitchens, and sometimes helped with laundry. She had no special skills. She was just an Omega. The words came out apologetic, as if her very existence required justification, and fell short. Matthias listened with an expression that might have been curiosity, or might have been contempt. It was impossible to tell. Then he did something that made Lena's blood turn to ice. He invited her to approach the throne. Not a request, but a command, delivered with the expectation of immediate obedience. The crowd parted as Lena moved forward on legs that felt like water, every eye in the hall fixed on her, hundreds of witnesses to whatever humiliation was about to unfold. When she reached the platform and dropped to her knees as protocol demanded, Matthias studied her for a long moment before speaking again. He asked the assembly if anyone knew anything remarkable about Lena Ashford, if she had ever demonstrated any particular talent or achieved anything noteworthy. The silence that followed was answer. Enough. Then he smiled, and it was the cruelest expression Lena had ever seen, cold and sharp as a blade. He announced that he wanted to try an experiment, that he had heard old stories about Omegas possessing hidden gifts that only emerged under pressure. He said he was curious to see if there was any truth to such tales, or if they were merely fantasies meant to comfort the powerless. Before Lena could process what was happening, Matthias ordered his guards to take her to the center of the hall and demonstrate what happened when an Omega was pushed beyond their limits. The guards moved with mechanical efficiency, hauling Lena to her feet and dragging her to the middle of the marble floor where everyone could see clearly. One of them forced her to her knees again, while another ripped the shoulder of her dress, exposing skin that bore old scars from previous punishments. Matthias explained to the assembly that he had read accounts from centuries past describing Omegas who could supposedly access extraordinary abilities in moments of extreme distress, gifts that made them valuable beyond their typical domestic functions. He said he wanted to test whether Lena was one of these rare individuals or just another unremarkable Omega with delusions of significance. If she was watching this, he suggested the audience might want to pay close attention because they might witness either a miracle or a confirmation of everything they already believed about Omega inadequacy. The first blow came without warning, a guard's hand connecting with Lena's face hard enough to split her lip and send her sprawling sideways on the marble. Pain exploded through her skull, bright and disorienting, and she tasted copper on her tongue. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard Matthias asking if she felt anything awakening inside her, any surge of power or sudden awareness of hidden ability. When she could only sob in response, unable to form words through the pain and terror, he sighed dramatically and told the guard to continue. Another blow landed on her ribs, then another, each impact accompanied by Matthias's clinical observations about stress responses and survival instincts. He was treating her torture like a scientific demonstration, his tone almost bored, as if her suffering was merely data to be collected and analyzed. Lena curled into herself, trying to protect her vital organs as the beating continued. She could hear people in the crowd murmuring, some with disgust at the display, others with cold satisfaction at seeing an Omega reminded of her place. No one moved to intervene. No one dared challenge the king's authority, even as he orchestrated cruelty for entertainment dressed as research. Lena's vision blurred with tears and blood, her body screaming with each new impact. And through it all, she felt the familiar shame that had defined her entire life. Shame at being weak, at being Omega, at failing to meet even the lowest expectations anyone had for her existence. She wanted to disappear, to cease existing entirely, rather than endure another moment of this public degradation. Then something shifted. The guard raised his hand for another blow, and Lena saw it coming toward her in crystalline detail. She could count the scars on his knuckles, see individual beads of sweat forming on his wrist, notice the way his muscles tensed in preparation for impact. Time seemed to stretch impossibly thin, each microsecond expanding into a vast space, where Lena existed alone with her terror. Her mind screamed for it to stop. Please just stop. Anything to make this end. And something inside her answered that desperate plea with a power she didn't understand. The world lurched sideways, and suddenly everything went perfectly, impossibly still. The guard's fist hung frozen in midair, caught between heartbeats. His expression was locked in concentration, every line of his face fixed like a photograph. Behind him, the other guard stood motionless, with one foot slightly raised, forever in the middle of a step he would never complete. Across the hall, pack members were suspended in various poses of attention or discomfort, some with mouths open mid-word, others with hands raised in gesture. Even the dust motes drifting through the chandelier's light had stopped moving, hanging in the air like tiny stars fixed in an invisible web. The only sound was Lena's own ragged breathing, the only movement her trembling body as she slowly uncurled from her defensive position and looked around at the frozen tableau. For several seconds, she couldn't process what she was seeing. Her mind supplied logical explanations. Hallucination from head trauma. A stress-induced break from reality. Death. And this was some kind of transitional state between life and whatever came after. But the frozen world remained stubbornly solid and real around her. Too detailed and consistent to be a dying vision. She pushed herself to her feet, swaying slightly, and reached out to touch the guard's suspended fist. His skin was warm, his muscles solid beneath her fingertips. But he didn't move, didn't react, didn't even seem aware of her touch. It was as if someone had pressed pause on the entire universe except for her. Panic gave way to a different kind of fear, vast and existential. Lena backed away from the guard, her eyes darting around the frozen hall, trying to understand what she had done and how to undo it. She could feel something humming beneath her skin, a vibration that seemed to resonate with her terror, feeding on it and growing stronger. Her grandmother's voice echoed in memory. Fragments of bedtime stories Lena had dismissed as fantasy. Stories about the temporal line. Omegas born with the ability to touch the fabric of time itself, to slow it or stop it or even reverse it under certain conditions. Lena had thought those were just tales meant to make Omega children feel special before they learned the harsh truth of their place in the world. But standing in a hall where time itself had obeyed her desperate command to stop, she realized the stories might have been history after all. She didn't know how long she stood there, frozen in her own paralysis of understanding, while the world waited in suspension around her. It might have been seconds or hours. Time had lost its usual meaning. Eventually, the humming beneath her skin began to fade, and with it came a terrible exhaustion that made her legs buckle. She collapsed back to her knees, gasping, and the world lurched back into motion with an almost audible snap. The guard's fist completed its trajectory, but Lena had moved, and it struck only air. He stumbled slightly, thrown off balance by the unexpected miss, while the other guard completed his interrupted step and nearly fell. Around the hall, people blinked in confusion, their conversations picking up mid-word, but with expressions that suggested they knew something was wrong, even if they couldn't identify what. Only Matthias seemed fully aware of what had happened. He was staring at Lena with an expression she couldn't read, his winter steel eyes wide with something that might have been shock or might have been hunger. He descended from the platform in 3 long strides and grabbed Lena's chin, forcing her to look up at him. His grip was iron as he demanded to know what she had just done, his voice low and urgent, and utterly devoid of the casual cruelty from moments before. When Lena could only shake her head, unable to explain what she herself didn't understand, Matthias's expression shifted into something calculating and possessive. He announced to the confused assembly that the ceremony was concluded, that everyone should return to their duties immediately, that what they had witnessed was pack business that didn't concern them. The dismissal was absolute, and people filed out quickly, grateful to escape the strange tension that had filled the hall. When they were alone except for 2 trusted guards stationed at the doors, Matthias released Lena's chin but remained crouched before her, studying her like she was a puzzle he was determined to solve. He told her that he had felt the moment. Time stopped, had been fully conscious while the rest of the world froze, held in place by some awareness that transcended normal perception. He said he knew what she was, what bloodline ran through her veins, and that she was either the most valuable asset Silvercrest had ever possessed, or the most dangerous threat to his reign. His hand moved to her throat, not squeezing but resting there in promise. He asked her if she knew what the temporal line could do at full power, if she understood that her ancestors had been hunted to extinction precisely because they could rewrite reality itself. When Lena whispered that she didn't know anything about any of that, Matthias smiled his cruel smile again and told her she was about to learn. The next weeks blurred together in a haze of training and testing that pushed Lena to the edge of her sanity. Matthias moved her from the Omega quarters to a private room in the palace's eastern wing, furnished comfortably but guarded constantly. She was no longer allowed to work in the kitchens or interact with other pack members. Instead, her days were consumed by Matthias's obsessive efforts to understand and control her ability. He brought her ancient texts describing the temporal line, accounts written by alphas who had hunted them, treaties that had been signed to regulate their powers before they vanished from recorded history. Lena learned that her gift was tied intrinsically to fear, that the adrenaline surge of terror acted as a catalyst that allowed her consciousness to step outside the normal flow of time. Matthias designed increasingly elaborate scenarios to trigger her ability. He would have guards burst into her room at random hours, would create situations where she believed herself in mortal danger, would expose her to carefully calibrated psychological torture that stopped just short of breaking her completely. Each time her fear spiked high enough, time would stutter and stop, and Lena would find herself alone in a frozen world, while Matthias observed from whatever place of awareness allowed him to remain conscious through her temporal manipulations. He took notes obsessively, documenting how long she could hold the freeze, how far the effect extended, what happened to objects she interacted with while time was stopped. The training was brutal, not just physically but emotionally. Lena had to live in a constant state of readiness for terror, never knowing when the next test would come, never allowed to feel safe even in sleep. Her ability grew stronger with use, the frozen moments lasting longer, her control becoming more refined. She learned she could move freely through the stopped time, could interact with frozen objects and people to a degree, could even extend the freeze beyond the immediate area if she concentrated hard enough while maintaining her fear response. But the cost was devastating. Each use left her drained and shaking, and the constant fear was eroding something fundamental in her psyche. She was becoming a weapon, refined and sharpened, and she hated it, even as some part of her took grim satisfaction in finally being valued for something beyond domestic labor. If you are enjoying this story of power, fear, and impossible choices, please consider liking this video and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps us continue bringing you these complex supernatural romances. Matthias was changing too, in ways that were subtle but unmistakable to someone forced to spend so much time in his presence. The cold, clinical approach to her training gradually gave way to something more personal, a curiosity that extended beyond her abilities to who she was as a person. He began asking her questions during rest, periods between training sessions, wanting to know about her childhood, her dreams, what she thought about when she was alone. At first, Lena answered in monosyllables, still terrified of him, still processing the whiplash of going from tortured Omega to valuable asset. But slowly, carefully, she began to see cracks in his armor of absolute control. He told her things he claimed he had never told anyone, late at night when exhaustion made both their guards lower. He described how his father, the previous king, had become obsessed with immortality in his final years, had conducted horrible experiments trying to merge different supernatural bloodlines, had ultimately made a deal with ancient powers that cost half the kingdom before Matthias killed him to end the madness. Matthias had been 19 when he took his father's head in front of the council, had spent the next decade rebuilding what had been destroyed, had learned to rule through fear, because fear was the only thing people seemed to respect. Every cruel act, every demonstration of ruthless power, was calculated to prevent anyone from ever thinking they could challenge him the way he had challenged his father. Lena listened to these confessions with mixed feelings. Part of her recognized the trauma beneath the tyranny, saw how a scared boy had armored himself in cruelty as survival strategy. Another part remained coldly aware that understanding the source of someone's cruelty didn't erase the harm they had caused. Matthias might have reasons for becoming a monster, but he was still a monster who had tortured her in front of hundreds of people as an experiment. Yet there was something compelling about watching him struggle with vulnerability, seeing him lower the mask he wore for the world, and reveal the damaged person beneath. It made him human in a way that was both terrifying and strangely intimate. The night everything changed started like so many others. Matthias had subjected Lena to another training session, this one involving a scenario where she believed the building was collapsing around her. Time had frozen perfectly, and she had held it for nearly an hour before exhaustion forced her to release it. She collapsed immediately, her body giving out, and Matthias caught her before she hit the floor. He carried her back to her room and sat with her while she recovered, as had become his habit. But this time, instead of launching into analysis of her performance or questions about her experience, He simply stayed quiet, his hand resting on her shoulder, in what might have been comfort, or might have been possession. Lena, her inhibitions lowered by exhaustion, asked him why he was doing this to her. Not the training itself. She understood the strategic value of what she represented, but the confession, the late-night vulnerability, the gradual erosion of boundaries between captor and captive. Matthias was silent for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he admitted that, when time stopped, when it was just the two of them existing in a frozen moment while the world waited, he felt something he hadn't felt since before his father's madness consumed everything. He felt safe. The admission came out raw and reluctant, as if torn from somewhere deep inside him. Lena turned to look at him, really look at him, and saw exhaustion that matched her own. This man who ruled through fear was admitting that her ability to stop time made him feel safe, and she understood the devastating irony of it. He had spent his entire adult life in hypervigilance, always watching for threats, always ready for betrayal, unable to trust anyone because trust had nearly destroyed his kingdom. But in the frozen moments Lena created, nothing could threaten him. No plots could unfold, no daggers could strike, no betrayals could manifest. For however long she held time still, he could simply exist without the crushing weight of his crown and his trauma. Something shifted between them. In that moment of mutual recognition, they were both prisoners, Lena realized. She was trapped by her fear and her power, by Matthias's control and the role he was forcing her into, but he was equally trapped by his throne and his trauma, by the calculated cruelty that had become his only defense against a world that had taught him love and trust, led only to devastation. Neither of them was free, and neither of them knew how to want freedom without destroying everything they had built as protection against vulnerability. The physical relationship that developed between them over the following weeks was as complicated as everything else that existed in the space they shared. It started with small touches that lingered too long, with eye contact that carried weight beyond words, with proximity that felt charged with possibility. Matthias began finding excuses to be near her outside of training, would sit close enough that their shoulders touched, would absently play with strands of her hair while they talked. Lena found herself leaning into the contact, despite everything her rational mind screamed about Stockholm Syndrome and power imbalances and the fundamental wrongness of developing feelings for someone who had tortured her. But the heart, Lena was learning, didn't care about rational objections. When Matthias finally kissed her, it was during one of her frozen moments. Time stopped all around them while they existed in a bubble of perfect stillness. His mouth was surprisingly gentle against hers, asking rather than demanding, and when Lena kissed him back, she felt something crack open inside her chest. This was madness, she knew. But it was also the only real connection she had ever felt with another person. They were both so damaged, both so trapped, and somehow in their brokenness they fit together in a way that felt inevitable, even as it felt impossible. They became lovers in the technical sense, though the relationship defied easy categorization. There was genuine care between them, moments of tenderness that seemed to surprise them both, but there was also the ever-present awareness of power imbalance, the fact that Matthias still controlled every aspect of Lena's life, that her compliance was never entirely voluntary, even when her participation was willing. They argued about it constantly, Matthias insisting that he would release her if she truly wanted freedom, Lena pointing out that she had nowhere to go and no way to survive outside. His protection with the power she possessed. The circular nature of their dynamic was exhausting, and neither of them had solutions. The conspiracy revealed itself gradually, pieces of a puzzle that Lena didn't know she was assembling until the picture became undeniable. It started with research she was conducting in the ancient texts Matthias had provided, looking for information about how her ancestors had controlled their abilities without being consumed by constant fear. She found references to something called the catalyst death, ritualistic murders designed to traumatize surviving temporal line omegas so severely that their gifts would awaken explosively and uncontrollably. The text suggested these catalysts were often personal, the murder of someone the Omega loved, staged to look like an accident, but timed perfectly to maximize psychological damage. Lena's hands shook as she read the descriptions. her mind immediately connecting the pattern to her own history. Her mother had died when Lena was 7, supposedly in a random fire that consumed the small house where they lived on the edge of Pact territory. Lena had been at market with her grandmother when it happened, had returned to find nothing but ash and her mother's charred body. The grief had been overwhelming, had consumed her childhood, and shaped everything that came after. She had spent years waiting for her own gift to manifest as her mother's had, some small ability that would make her feel connected to the woman she had lost. When nothing appeared, when she remained powerless and unremarkable, the disappointment had been crushing. But what if the fire hadn't been an accident? What if someone had known her mother carried the temporal line bloodline and had orchestrated her death specifically to trigger Lena's latent ability through trauma? The problem was that Lena's gift hadn't appeared in the immediate aftermath of her mother's murder. Either the catalyst had failed, or something else had prevented the awakening everyone had apparently expected. Lena pulled every record she could find about Pack activities in the year her mother died, cross-referencing names and dates and looking for patterns. What she found made her blood run cold. 3 weeks before her mother's death, there had been a meeting between high-ranking members of several Packs, including Silvercrest. The official record said they were discussing trade agreements, but Lena found marginal notes in archived documents that told a different story. They had been discussing the last known survivors of the temporal line, specifically Lena's mother, and whether she posed a threat to territorial stability. One name appeared repeatedly in those notes, in a handwriting Lena recognized because she had seen it countless times in the documents Matthias had shown her. The handwriting belonged to Magnus Blackthorn, Matthias's father, the Mad King who had destroyed half the kingdom in his quest for power. The implications were staggering. Magnus had known about Lena's bloodline, had likely ordered the death of her mother as part of his larger experiments with supernatural power. The fire hadn't been a random tragedy, but a calculated assassination designed to eliminate a potential threat or trigger an asset he could then control. Matthias would have been a teenager at the time, probably unaware of his father's schemes, but the connection between her greatest trauma and his family legacy was undeniable. Lena felt sick as she processed the information, trying to decide what to do with knowledge that could shatter the fragile connection she and Matthias had built. She confronted him that night, presenting the evidence she had compiled and demanding to know what he knew about his father's involvement in her mother's death. Matthias's reaction confirmed her worst fears. He hadn't known the specific details, but he had suspected something, had known his father collected information about rare bloodlines and had conducted experiments throughout his reign. The possibility that Magnus had ordered the death of Lena's mother fit perfectly with everything Matthias knew about the man. His face was pale as he listened to Lena's accusations, and when she demanded to know if he would have done the same thing, if he would have killed someone she loved to trigger her abilities, he couldn't immediately answer. The silence stretched between them, heavy with betrayal and recognition. Finally, Matthias admitted that a year ago, before he knew her, before any of this had started, he might have done exactly what his father did. The strategic value of controlling a temporal line Omega was immense, and he had been taught that kingdoms were built on difficult choices and necessary cruelty. But now, knowing her, caring about her in whatever twisted way their relationship allowed, he wanted to believe he would make a different choice. The uncertainty in his voice was more damning than certainty would have been. He didn't know what he would do, couldn't promise that his nature wouldn't override his feelings if he was forced to choose between her and his kingdom. Lena felt something break inside her with that admission. She had been building towards something with Matthias, had allowed herself to imagine that maybe they could find a way forward together, that their damage could heal in proximity rather than compound. But this was the limit of what their relationship could survive. She couldn't love someone who might replicate the greatest trauma of her life given the right circumstances, who saw her first as an asset and only secondarily as a person. The betrayal wasn't that Matthias had done anything directly. It was that he couldn't absolutely swear he wouldn't, that some part of him would always see her through the lens of strategic value rather than simple humanity. She told him she needed time, needed space to process everything she had learned. Matthias agreed, looking hollowed out by the conversation, and left her alone in her room with guards still posted outside because even now, even in the middle of their personal catastrophe, she wasn't free to leave. Lena sat in the darkness and felt the weight of her power more heavily than ever before. She had the ability to reach back through time, to potentially rewrite the moment of her mother's death and prevent the trauma that had shaped her entire existence. The text she had been reading suggested it was theoretically possible, though incredibly dangerous. Reaching that far back would require fear so intense it might shatter her mind. And the paradoxes involved in preventing your own traumatic awakening were complex enough that previous attempts had reportedly erased the time travelers from existence entirely, but the temptation was overwhelming. She could save her mother, could give herself the childhood she deserved, could prevent Magnus Blackthorne from ever getting his hooks into her bloodline. The cost might be her own life or existence. But weighed against the possibility of undoing so much pain, the price almost seemed worth it. Lena spent the night wrestling with the decision, playing out scenarios in her mind, trying to calculate whether she was choosing courage or cowardice, justice or suicide. Morning brought an unexpected development. Matthias returned with information that changed everything. He had spent the night interrogating some of his father's former advisors, people who had survived Magnus's reign by being useful and quiet. One of them, under pressure, had admitted to being present at the meeting where Magnus ordered the death of Lena's mother, but the assassination hadn't been Magnus's idea originally. It had been suggested by someone else, someone who supposedly had the kingdom's best interests at heart, and who argued that the temporal line was too dangerous to exist outside direct alpha control. The advisor gave Matthias a name, and it was one that made everything infinitely more complicated. The person who had convinced Magnus to order the murder was Richard Ashford, Lena's own grandfather, a man she had never met because he had supposedly died before she was born. Except he hadn't died. He had gone into hiding after Magnus's death, afraid that his role in various schemes would be discovered. He was still alive, still in the kingdom, and according to the advisor, he had argued for killing his own daughter because he believed her refusal to use her temporal abilities for the Pack's benefit was a betrayal of their bloodline's responsibility. He had wanted Lena to inherit the power with none of her mother's moral qualms, had orchestrated his own daughter's murder to create the perfect traumatized weapon. The revelation destroyed something fundamental in Lena's understanding of her own history. She had always believed her grandfather's side of the family had been victims of Magnus's cruelty, had vanished into obscurity or death because they couldn't protect themselves from a Mad King's paranoia. To learn that her grandfather had been complicit, had actively participated in her mother's death out of twisted ambition for his bloodline's legacy, was almost too much to bear. It also complicated her desire to reach back and prevent the assassination. If her grandfather had been the instigator, if the threat had come from her own family rather than external enemies, what would changing the past actually solve? Matthias told her that he had Richard Ashford in custody, that he was prepared to execute the man for his crimes, if that was what Lena wanted, but he also offered her an alternative. He could arrange for Lena to confront her grandfather, to hear directly from him why he had made the choices he made, to decide for herself what justice looked like in this situation. The offer was complicated by the fact that Matthias obviously had his own agenda. Keeping Richard alive meant keeping someone who knew about the temporal line and might have useful information. But there was also something that seemed like genuine care in the way Matthias presented the choice, an acknowledgement that this decision should be Lena's to make. She agreed to meet with Richard Ashford, though every instinct screamed at her to refuse. The man who awaited her in the palace's secure chamber was elderly, but sharp-eyed, his resemblance to her mother visible in the shape of his face and the set of his shoulders. He showed no remorse. When Lena confronted him about the murder, instead launching into a speech about bloodline responsibility and the greater good, he claimed that his daughter had been weak, that she had refused to develop her abilities properly because she was afraid of what they might turn her into. He had seen Lena's potential as an infant, had known she would inherit an even stronger version of the gift, and had made the calculated decision that one life lost could mean power preserved for future generations. Richard seemed to genuinely believe he had made the right choice, that Lena should be thanking him for creating the circumstances that allowed her abilities to manifest. He talked about their bloodline as if it was a sacred trust, as if their personal feelings and lives were irrelevant compared to the duty of maintaining and passing on their temporal powers. Listening to him, Lena felt a cold clarity settle over her. This man was what she would become if she let her power define her completely. If she started seeing everything and everyone through the lens of strategic value and bloodline preservation. He was what Matthias was afraid of becoming, what Magnus had been in his final years. She asked Richard if he had ever loved her mother as a person, or only as a vessel for bloodline continuation. He seemed confused by the question, as if the distinction was meaningless. Of course he had loved his daughter, he insisted, but love didn't exempt anyone from duty or responsibility. Lena felt something settle in her chest, a decision crystallizing. She told her grandfather that she wouldn't use her power to go back and save her mother, not because the past couldn't be changed, but because she was choosing to accept it. Her mother's death had been a tragedy and a crime, but it had also shaped Lena into someone who understood the difference between power and wisdom, someone who could see the cost of treating people as assets rather than souls. Richard's face twisted with rage and disappointment. He called her weak like her mother, said she was wasting a gift that could reshape the world, predicted that she would regret her cowardice. Lena listened calmly, and then told him something that seemed to shake him more than any anger could have. She said she pitied him. He had lived his entire life enslaved by his own power, had sacrificed his daughter and his humanity on the altar of bloodline preservation. And for what? He was a prisoner awaiting execution, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about the difference between strength and cruelty. If that was what the temporal line's full potential demanded, Lena wanted no part of it. She left the chamber and told Matthias to proceed with whatever justice he deemed appropriate for Richard's crimes. Matthias nodded, studying her face carefully, and then did something unexpected. He told her she was free to leave if she wanted, that he would release her from the palace and provide resources for her to start a life elsewhere. The offer seemed to cost him something to make, his expression carefully neutral, even as his hands clenched at his sides. He admitted that keeping her had been selfish, that he had justified it as strategic necessity, but really, it was because he was terrified of going back to the hyper-vigilant existence he had known before her ability made him feel safe. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about power, redemption, and the courage to choose freedom over safety. New romances. Posted regularly. Lena considered the offer seriously, weighing freedom against everything that would mean. She could leave, could try to build a life outside Matthias's control, could find a way to exist without constantly living on the edge of terror that fueled her abilities. But she would also be leaving behind the only person who truly understood what her power meant, the only one who could share the frozen moments when time stopped and the world waited. More than that, she would be leaving Matthias to his trauma and his throne, abandoning someone who had shown her genuine vulnerability, even if he had also shown her cruelty. She told him she would stay, but on different terms, not as prisoner or asset, or even lover in the way they had been. She wanted to work with him to figure out how to use her abilities in ways that didn't require constant terror, to find the balance her mother had supposedly sought before her death. She wanted Matthias to dismantle some of the crueler aspects of his rule, to stop using fear as his primary tool of governance, because she had seen firsthand how that path led only to isolation and devastation. And she wanted honesty between them, real honesty about motives and feelings, and the constant negotiation of power that defined their relationship. Matthias agreed, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely sure how to fulfill those terms. They spent the next months in an extended negotiation of what their relationship could be when stripped of overt coercion. It was harder than either of them expected. Matthias kept defaulting to command and control, because that was all he knew, while Lena struggled with the reality that even with nominal freedom, she was still dependent on him for protection and resources in a pack hierarchy that gave Omegas few options. They argued frequently, sometimes viciously, about everything from policy decisions to personal boundaries to whether genuine partnership was even possible given how they had started. but slowly, incrementally, things changed. Matthias began including Omega perspectives in council decisions, started dismantling some of the most degrading aspects of the hierarchy. It wasn't revolutionary change, and many alphas grumbled about the Omega King's dangerous influence, but it was movement in a direction that felt more sustainable. Lena worked with scholars to research her bloodline's history, looking for accounts of temporal line Omegas who had learned to access their abilities without requiring terror as fuel. She found references to meditation techniques, to building tolerance for fear responses, to gradually expanding control through practice rather than trauma. Her relationship with Matthias evolved into something neither of them had words for. They weren't quite lovers anymore, the physical intimacy having faded as they renegotiated boundaries, but they weren't simply allies either. They existed in a space of deep understanding built on shared damage, where they could be completely honest about their worst impulses, because the other person had already seen them at their worst. Matthias could admit when he felt the urge to control her, and Lena could acknowledge when she wanted to run, rather than do the hard work of staying. The honesty was brutal, but also sustaining. 2 years after that first ceremony where Matthias had tortured her in front of the assembly, Lena did something she had never imagined possible. She stood before a similar gathering and demonstrated her ability publicly, but this time on her own terms. She stopped time through conscious choice rather than fear, holding the freeze for several minutes while Matthias explained to the assembly what they were witnessing. When she released it, the crowd erupted in a mix of awe and alarm. Some alphas called for her to be contained or destroyed as a threat. Others saw the strategic value and wanted her abilities weaponized for the pack's benefit. Matthias silenced them, all with a gesture, and made a speech that Lena had helped him write. He talked about the difference between fear-based control and trust-based leadership, about how the temporal line had been hunted to extinction, precisely because alphas had treated them as weapons rather than people. He announced new laws protecting rare bloodlines from exploitation, established councils where Omegas would have actual voting power, and made it clear that anyone who moved against Lena would be moving against him. Directly. It wasn't a perfect solution, and Lena knew there would be resistance and potential danger going forward, but it was a start toward something different than the cycle of trauma and control that had defined their history. The epilogue came 5 years later, in a moment Lena wouldn't have believed possible when this all began. She stood in the same ceremonial hall where Matthias had once ordered her beaten, but now she stood beside him as an acknowledged partner in governance, if not, officially, his mate. The mate bond had never formed between them. That mystical connection that was supposed to link compatible souls. Maybe they were too damaged for that kind of magic. Or maybe the bond required a foundation of equals that they were still building toward. Either way, its absence no longer felt like a rejection, but simply a fact they lived with. They were announcing the formation of a new council specifically dedicated to researching and protecting rare supernatural bloodlines. With representatives from every pack in the region, Lena would lead it, using her own experiences to guide policy that prevented others from being exploited the way she had been. It was terrifying and exciting, and probably impossible, but she had learned that impossible was a relative term when you could literally stop time. As she looked out at the assembly, at faces that ranged from supportive to skeptical to openly hostile, she felt her grandfather's words echo in memory. He had called her weak, predicted she would regret not using her power to its full potential. He had been wrong. Lena had accessed her power's full potential, had learned to stop time without fear, had even managed brief glimpses of past and future timelines, though she refused to manipulate them. But she had done it without sacrificing her humanity, without becoming the weapon everyone seemed to think she should be. That took more strength than any amount of temporal manipulation ever could. Beside her, Matthias was tense in the way he always was during public appearances, his trauma making trust difficult even after years of therapy and work. But when their eyes met, she saw recognition there, an acknowledgement that they were both still fighting their demons, but at least they were fighting together. The future stretched ahead of them uncertain and complicated, full of political battles and personal struggles, and the constant negotiation of power between people who had every reason not to trust each other but were choosing to try anyway. Lena's ability to stop time gave her power over the present moment, but the future remained unwritten and unpredictable. She found comfort in that uncertainty rather than fear. Some things shouldn't be controlled, even if you had the power to do so. Some moments were meant to unfold naturally, in real time, with all the risk and possibility that implied. As the ceremony concluded and people began filing out, Matthias took her hand in a gesture he still rarely allowed himself in public. His palm was warm against hers, solid and real and present in the now they were building together, one difficult choice at a time. Lena squeezed back, feeling the weight of everything they had survived and everything they still needed to face. She didn't know if they would make it, if their relationship would ever become something healthy and whole, or if they were forever destined to exist in this liminal space between damage and healing. But she knew she was choosing to stay and fight for the possibility, choosing the hard work of transformation over the fantasy of erasing the past. Time moved forward, carrying them with it into an unknown future. And for once, Lena was content to let it flow naturally, rather than reaching out to stop or change it. That was its own kind of power, she had learned. The power to accept what was, to work with what remained, and to build something new from the broken pieces rather than trying to force reality to conform to what should have been. It wasn't the ending she had imagined when this all began, but it was the one she chose. And in choosing it freely, with full awareness of its costs and limitations, she had finally claimed the agency that fear and power had both denied her for so long.